I was sitting out in the lobby. I went to the bathroom. When I left the bathroom, oh, wait a minute.
Thank you, George, and thanks to all of you who are still bravely soldiering on as we get to the tail end of the afternoon of the symposium. Francis Marion is, of course, best known for his leadership in the partisan war of 1780 to 1781 in South Carolina, during which you're all familiar with his success against not only British troops but the Loyalist militia. Once he had accomplished much of his task of clearing South Carolina, clearing the British and their supporters from South Carolina, he had to face a new challenge, one that we don't think about so often, and that was to take his militia, men who he'd been leading in an irregular war, and bring them down and unite with Nathaniel Greene's Continental Army to fight a set-piece, open-field battle against British forces. So this is in a completely different environment for him and for his troops, one that a lot depended on and that he might not have been expected to do so well in. Fortunately, he had extensive experience which he was able to put to good use, and as a result he and his soldiers did play a key role at the Battle of Eutaw Springs on September 8, 1781. A little bit about his long military background that helped make him an effective officer, not only at Eutaw Springs, but throughout his career. His first military experience came in 1761, when he was just about 19 years old. He enlisted for service in the Cherokee War in the South Carolina backcountry, and this was in the colonial militia. He was commissioned first lieutenant in a company commanded by somebody else who would rise to prominence in the Revolution, William Moultrie. The unit took part in British General James Grant's expedition against the Cherokees. Marion participated in only one battle, but distinguished himself at the time for his courage under fire, a trait he would continue to show. It wasn't until June of 1775 that Marion returned to military service. When South Carolinians learned that fighting had broken out in Massachusetts at Lexington and Concord, they began preparing to defend themselves against royal forces. Marion was commissioned a captain in what was then a state regiment, the 2nd Infantry Regiment of South Carolina, again serving under Moultrie, who had been commissioned that unit's colonel. In February 1776, Marion was promoted to major. He served in the defense of Fort Moultrie outside Charleston when the British Navy attacked on June 28th of 1776. In September of that year, the Continental Congress took control of South Carolina's state infantry regiments, and at that point, the 2nd South Carolina State Regiment became the 2nd South Carolina Continental Regiment. And so Marion went from being a major in the state service to being a major in the Continental service. He continued to serve as a regular officer, earned promotion to lieutenant colonel, and remained active right up until the capture of Charleston, and you're all familiar with how he avoided that. He then embarked on his partisan career, something else most people are familiar with. But one aspect that I want to point out that I think helped influence his leadership abilities later, as did his experience as a Continental officer, was that unlike many partisan leaders who tended to fight completely independently, Marion served for a considerable amount of time with his militia alongside the Continental forces of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee and Lee's Legion. So this again exposed him and his men to Continental forces and the need to cooperate, to coordinate. The cooperation between Lee and Marion was very successful. Both men had a lot in common. They were skilled at the type of partisan war they were fighting. They were strict disciplinarians who exerted good control over their troops, prevented breakdown into things like plundering that other units were better known for. And Marion, even though he had by now been raised to a brigadier general in the South Carolina militia, was willing to listen to advice from people like Henry Lee, who of course was always willing to give advice not only to Marion but to Nathaniel Greene, to George Washington, and to just about anybody else who would listen. The ability of Lee and Marion to cooperate proved that Greene was a good judge of his subordinates. When Greene decided to dispatch Lee to cooperate with the partisans in South Carolina, he first and very briefly considered sending Lee to work with Thomas Sumter. And after a few moments, perhaps, of reflection, Greene realized that given the personalities of Lee and Sumter, that this would result in no cooperation whatsoever. And then Greene thought about Marion and said, I think Lee and Marion can work together. He was absolutely right. In April of 1781, their capture of Fort Watson forced the British to abandon Camden. They subsequently captured another key post at Fort Mott. Marion then went on to the operations that Charles described throughout the summer of 1781, culminating in the Battle of Parker's Ferry, while Lee went west to Augusta, Georgia, where he again cooperated with Andrew Pickens, clearing the backcountry of that state from the British presence. Well, as a result of these successful operations, the Americans have regained control of the southern backcountry. And then at that point, of course, Greene went into camp at the high hills of Santee, where he was able to allow his army to recover. He sent Lee to watch British forces and their activities while Marion continued his campaign. And it was during this time that a British force that Lee estimated at 1,600 men began probing deeper into the interior of South Carolina, marching along the south bank of the Santee River, and eventually to the Congaree near McCord's Ferry. Lee saw an opportunity in this, and he began advising Greene to attack this British force, which was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart, who had succeeded Lord Rawdon when Rawdon went home. Stewart lacked Rawdon's military talents. James Weems, one of his subordinates, later described him as altogether a brave officer, but too fond of the bottle. So maybe that's where his courage came from. But in any case, Stewart apparently had no significant combat experience in the British Army, simply happened to be the highest ranking officer willing to go out in the field who was available. And so Lee saw this opportunity, urged Greene to attack Stewart's force, and on August 14th, Greene told Lee that Stewart had provided him with so good an opportunity of giving the enemy a deadly blow. And he added that he was willing to risk the attack with only his Continentals if necessary, but that he was worried that a victory using only his Continental troops would result in heavy casualties, and that might not be worthwhile, and that a defeat might prove disastrous. Then he added 600 or 800 militia would make the business easy and success certain. So he's thinking now that if he had some militia, and Greene had not always been a fan of militia, but he had seen more of what militia could accomplish, and I think was gaining confidence in Marion, thought this was a good idea. And on August 23rd, he finally decided to carry his plan out. He actually decided a little earlier, but marched on that day from the high hills after issuing orders to various detached forces, militia units, everybody in the area, the South Carolina state troops under William Henderson, to unite with the main army. But he didn't send Marion any instructions at this time because he knew Marion was obviously heavily involved in his campaign. And furthermore, Marion was closer to the position that Greene wanted to reach than these other units. So he didn't have to worry about Marion. He knew he'd be there when the time came. And finally, Marion, right after the Battle of Parker's Ferry, on the night of September 1st, marched 42 miles, he recorded, towards Eutaw Springs, where he found that Stewart's force was still encamped, and he dashed off a note to Greene saying that the British were at Eutaw Springs and that he was nearby. Greene replied with some lavish praise for Marion's operations and his victory at Parker's Ferry, and then informed Marion of his plan to attack the British. He said that he wanted to form a junction with Marion's force as soon as possible, but told Marion not to worry about moving towards the main army, that the main army would move towards him. He knew that after that rough campaign, all that mileage Marion and his troops had covered, the fighting, that they were fatigued, they needed a little rest. The main army was moving in their direction, so he said, just stay there, we'll come to you. On September 6th, Marion told Greene that he received the instructions, that at the time he had got them, he had been camped 20 miles below Eutaw Springs, but that he, having rested his troops, wanted to move closer to Greene, and therefore had ordered a night march, since he had to go around the enemy, and that he had reached one of Henry Lawrence's plantations, and would stay there to await orders, as his men and horses, he said, were greatly fatigued once again from this long night march. Greene and the rest of the army joined Marion the next day, and together they marched to Burdell's Tavern on September 7th, where they camped for the night, Greene preparing to attack the British at Eutaw Springs the next day. Greene was pretty pleased with his position. He was within 7 miles of the British army, and Stewart did not know that Greene had concentrated this large force so close to him. Greene had high hopes of taking the British by surprise. When he issued his order of march the night before the battle, and the troops set off in the early pre-dawn hours of September 7th, each unit was marching in its march order according to where Greene planned their positions to be in the line of battle when it was formed. Lee's Legion was in front. Lieutenant Colonel William Henderson's state troops were immediately behind them. Then the North Carolina militia under the Marquis de Malmedy, a French officer, followed by Marion and Andrew Piecuch with the South Carolina militia. Then the Continentals followed behind. Unfortunately for Greene, 2 of his soldiers deserted during the night, made their way to the British camp, and early in the morning were brought to Stewart, and they informed him that Greene was nearby and was marching to attack. Stewart was a little skeptical, but after hearing them out, he finally decided to dispatch Major John Coffin and his dragoons and some light infantry to scout the road from Burdell's to the British camp. Coffin, about 4 miles from the camp, encountered the vanguard of Greene's column, mistook it for militia in the dark, and very rashly charged and was repulsed. So he came back and informed Stewart that, yes, Greene was coming, that he had been unable to do anything to impede their progress. Stewart began forming his troops for battle. Greene did as well as they moved forward. And Greene was using the same system that Daniel Morgan had advised and had employed at Cowpens, mostly militia in the front, Continentals in the second line. On the left of the American front line, which was the northern end, the Americans were actually facing east of the British west at Eutaw Springs. Colonel Henderson's state troops guarded the left flank. Then came Pickens's brigade of South Carolina militia. Malmady's North Carolina militia were in the center. Marion on the right, or to the right, I should say. Marion, it's reported, the only figures we have are from William Johnson's Life of Greene. He gives Marion's figures at 240. Whether that's all ranks or whether that's rank and file fit for duty, we don't know. Pickens sent a return to Greene shortly before the battle, but we don't have that either. So Lee's Legion, however, if Marion had 240 men total or whatever it was, Lee's Legion had the far right of the line, anchoring the line. The Continentals deployed behind them, at which point Greene, probably about 9 a.m., ordered the first line to advance and attack the British, and they did so, driving in the British skirmishers to the main line, and then they came under fire, began exchanging volleys with the British. One of Marion's soldiers wrote that the brigade's marksmen fired with great precision, galling the enemy greatly. It's estimated by some participants that Marion's troops actually fired 17 rounds per man, which is pretty impressive in toe-to-toe combat with veteran British and provincial troops. The North Carolinians to their left, however, didn't do quite so well. After firing only 3 or 4 rounds, they began to break and fall back, leaving Marion's left flank exposed. If you know about the tactics of the time, the most dangerous thing to have is an exposed flank. The enemy can pour in fire, and you're not really in a position to return it. Fortunately, Greene reacted quickly and sent the North Carolina Continentals from his second line into the space that was being vacated by the North Carolina militia, thus keeping his front line intact and allowing it to continue to battle the British. Apparently, to allow room for the more numerous Continentals to replace the militia, Marion had to shift his brigade to the right. One of his soldiers, William Vaughan, recalled having orders from Marion, or having heard from Marion and his officers, that Greene had told the brigade to fire 12 volleys. If he could just get that from them, that would be more than he expected. So if they fired 17, that's much more than Greene expected. But Vaughan recalled that after firing the first 12 rounds, that Marion ordered the brigade to advance obliquely to its right, whereupon the troops returned to their original angle facing the British and opened fire on the British flank. So I suspect this movement was to, as the North Carolina Continentals came in, they needed more space. They were far more numerous than the North Carolina militia, and so Marion shifted his brigade to the right, allowing the Continentals room in the line. And this is a pretty difficult maneuver to make under fire, especially for militia. So again, Marion deserves credit for being able to make this maneuver. The struggle, however, as it went on, began to take a toll on Marion's brigade. First of all, the heat was intense. One of Marion's troops, John Painter, wrote later that the day was excessively hot, and just about every soldier on either side who remarked about the temperature noted that. It was extremely hot, unusually hot, even for a South Carolina early September day. The enemy fire also took its toll. John Kolb was wounded by a musket ball in his left knee. Jim Capers, a free black, had an interesting story. He had been drum major under Marion when Marion was in the 2nd South Carolina Continentals. When Marion became partisan afterwards, Capers stayed with him and continued to function as a drum major. Who would know that even a partisan unit would have its corps of musicians, but apparently Marion kept that tradition from the Continentals. Capers, acting as drum major again at Eutaw Springs, was wounded 4 times. He said he had 2 cuts on the face, a sword cut to the head, and that he was pierced through the body by a musket ball. The ball, he said, went completely through and killed the drummer behind him, a gentleman named Paul Ram Lee, who may also have been a free black or a slave. But he was killed by this ball. James Delaney, who usually was a cook for Marion's men, that day had exchanged his pots and ladles for a musket, and he was also wounded. So there was some pretty heavy fighting going on here. Even those who weren't injured talked about how fierce the battle was. Benjamin Thompson said it was the most severely fought battle he had ever participated in. And another of Marion's men, Henry Goodman, called it the hottest of battles. So you can imagine this long time in the heat, under heavy fire. But the brigade stood its ground, although it eventually, of course, was checked and could not continue to advance, but continued to exchange fire with the British. Well, the North Carolinians, again not so lucky. This time it's the Continentals to Marion's left who give way. So consider Marion's militia has fought longer, not only than the North Carolina militia, but the 2 regiments of North Carolina Continentals who replaced them and who were the next unit to break again in the center. Marion's left is again exposed. This time, however, the British, seeing another unit and a Continental unit breaking, launched a spontaneous bayonet charge. This was not ordered. Stuart had gone to reorganize his troops and left the front line to the New York loyalist John Harris Cruger, the defender of 96. Cruger had tactical command of the British Army except the reserve, which consisted only of Coffin's cavalry. So Stuart was in the back supervising Coffin in the wagon train, maybe indulging in some of that liquid courage he favored from the wagon train, while Cruger is managing the battle. And Cruger pointed out he never gave orders to advance, but some of the British troops, possibly those in front of the North Carolina Continentals, seeing the breaking ranks of the enemy, decide to charge. Everybody in the line decides to charge, and so they push forward. Marion's men began to withdraw. He ordered them to retreat, realizing his flank was exposed again. And it was probably at this time that Capers, the drum major, was wounded by a British officer's sword, because the fighting would have gotten close at this point. James McMillan, one of Marion's soldiers, was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet during this charge. But few, if any, of Marion's men were captured. He managed to get them out of the way and off the field. Greene, again, seeing this, sees opportunity. Seeing the British advancing and breaking ranks, he gave orders for the Virginia and Maryland Continentals, who had thus far been in reserve, to charge with trailed arms, not firing, basically to make a bayonet attack and drive away the British. And it worked. Seeing the Continentals advancing, Marion ordered his troops, as they withdrew, to shift farther to the Virginians' right, to allow them clear passage to get at the British who were coming up behind them. So again, this is some cool decision making. You're trying to get your brigade away under fire. The British are coming behind you with bayonets. The Virginians are coming forward, and Marion has to make this maneuver again with retreating troops. So this is an excellent tactical performance in battle that he's put together here. He reformed his brigade while the Continentals and the British were battling it out. And when the American advance bogged down, Greene sent for Marion again and committed his brigade in a final effort to break the British line. It was unsuccessful. But again, being able to reform a brigade of militia after this kind of fighting and bring it back to the field says a lot about Marion's ability as a battlefield leader in a set-piece battle, something that, again, we don't think about. Greene broke off the battle 4 hours after it began. This is one of the longest open field battles of the war. Went back to Burdell's, and once they got back to camp, the officers tallied their losses. There are actually several different official casualty returns for the Americans at Eutaw Springs. One that was recorded by Captain Robert Kirkwood of the Delaware Continentals listed the total losses of the South Carolina militia, that would include Pickens and Marion's brigades, at 2 killed and 27 wounded. We don't know if this includes the other South Carolina militiamen. Before the battle, Greene apparently assigned other, and these may have been oddball units, militia that had been coming in, to William Washington's cavalry and to Henry Lee's Legion to strengthen those units. So there were many South Carolina militiamen assigned to both of those units. So we don't know if these were included in Kirkwood's figures. The casualties are certainly an understatement. Henry Lee noted that after the battle, he said that both Greene and his opposite number on the British side, Stewart, understated their losses. In addition, the figures just don't seem to work. The North Carolina militia that fired only 3 or 4 shots, about 1/3 of the fighting that Marion's brigade did. So you could figure Marion's brigade was engaged at least 3 times longer initially. This isn't counting their return to battle. The North Carolinians under Malmedy reported 6 killed, 31 wounded, and 8 missing. If Marion's larger brigade was under fire for 3 times as long, and the casualty figures also include Pickens's 300+ men, it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have, that they would have suffered far fewer losses. In fact, if they were engaged 3 times longer with larger numbers, the casualties may have been 3 times as high as the North Carolinians were. We don't know that for sure, but we know from the work Larry Babbitts has done on cowpens with the pension applications that in the case of the official American casualty figures versus the losses reported, on pension applications, people who reported being wounded or reported a friend or an officer or a fellow soldier being killed or injured, that the casualties there were much higher, and this is probably true as Henry Lee believed. Greene was effusive in his praise for Marion's performance that day. He also shared that praise with Pickens, which was justified. Pickens's militia did very well also, but in an unusual act of generosity, when praising the militia, Greene also extended that praise to Malmedy's North Carolinians, who didn't fight for very long. But he did say that the militia answered his most sanguine expectations, which is pretty good because Greene had not, as I said, been thrilled with the militia before. He told Governor John Rutledge that the militia's performance, the South Carolina militia's performance, did honor to that class of soldiers, and told Thomas McKean, the president of the Continental Congress, that General Marion, Colonel Malmedy, and General Pickens conducted the troops with great gallantry and good conduct, and the militia fought with a spirit and firmness that reflects the highest honor, again, on this class of soldiers. So Greene very pleased with his militia that day. Rutledge also applauded Marion's and Pickens's leadership. He said that distrust of their own immediate commanders, which militia are too apt to be affected with, never produced an emotion where Marion and Pickens commanded. So what he's saying in his roundabout 18th century way is that a lot of times militiamen didn't have complete confidence in their officers, and it was reflected in their performance on the field. But with Marion and Pickens, this wasn't a factor. The troops had confidence in them. Marion characteristically was brief. He told Peter Rory, "My brigade behaved well." Didn't have much more to say than that. But he didn't have a whole lot of time to say anything because apparently this performance further increased Greene's confidence in him. And so the day after the battle on September 9th, when Greene decided to send out some units to try to keep Stuart from being reinforced by Major Archibald MacArthur's British detachment that was in the area, who did he pick? His famous combination 1-2 punch of Henry Lee and Francis Marion, and sent them off to try to keep MacArthur from reinforcing Stuart. They were too weak to do that. They did skirmish with MacArthur's troops. It did well. They captured 24 British soldiers and 4 loyalists, but they couldn't prevent the Union. But it didn't make any difference anyway, because on the night of September 9th, Stuart retreated toward Charleston, ending any long-term British threat other than raids like the Rice raids to the interior of South Carolina. So it may have been late in the war before militia proved itself to skeptical Continental officers like Greene, but Marion was able to do so, drawing upon his experience as a Continental officer, his cooperation with Lee in the various operations, and his own skills leading not only by example but through strict discipline and gaining the confidence of his troops, to turn in a brilliant and relatively overlooked battlefield performance at Eutaw Springs. So any questions?
I have a question about Andrew Pickens, and you said that Greene came late to appreciate the militia. Andrew Pickens followed the Continental Army across on the race to the Dan, and then he was with Lee at Piles Hacking and at Wexel's Mill before he left and went back. Is there any account of what Greene thought about, I mean, toward the end of the war, yes, he praised Pickens, but in that campaign on the race to the Dan, is there any evidence of any opinion that Greene expressed of Andrew Pickens early?
Nothing that I can recall except the standard after an engagement, a rearguard action, or whatever, where he would, give the usual praise to, Colonel Lee, General Pickens, Colonel Williams for, their performance against the enemy. I think even, of course, at Guilford Courthouse, he's very critical of the North Carolina militia's performance afterward. I think he didn't really want to trust the militia until he could see how they fought under his own eyes in this type of battle. And he hadn't seen that. For all he knew, the cooperation between Lee and Pickens was all Lee's success, which I'm sure Lee wouldn't have hesitated to tell him privately, if not in his official letters. Lee was the mastermind of the whole war, if you listen to Henry Lee. But Greene hadn't been there to see most of these operations. He hadn't been there to see Augusta. He hadn't been there to observe Marion and Lee in action in the operations against the British supply lines. It's not till Eutaw Springs that he actually gets to see militia under him who perform well, because on the other occasions, as at Guilford, they don't perform well. So that skepticism dies hard, and I think that skepticism really dies, at least as far as Marion and Pickens are concerned, at Eutaw Springs, where Greene is there and is actually observing them, and then coming out with this really unusual praise from a Continental officer, other than Gates, who stopped doing that after August of 1780.
Jim, how long do you think the Marion militia was actually in the fight, and then also how far do you think they actually advanced?
James claims they advanced about a mile from their starting point. and that they were under fire the last half mile. That last half mile would have included driving in the pickets, so that would have been more skirmishing fire. If you figure advancing half a mile under fire at that kind of rate, maybe 6-7 minutes at another time to deploy and drive in the skirmishers, I would think 17 shots, if in making that oblique move, that's got to be another half hour. I would think they were probably in action, not counting going back in, close to an hour from the time they actually stepped off into the advance with the skirmishing, the maneuver, the breaking it off, which is quite a long time, longer than a lot of battles.
How close did he get to this? I think the point of reference to me is the tents, the British tents were. How close do you think they got to this?
Initially, probably not close enough because the British were posted in front of their line, and the brigade, as was the whole American First Line, was halted. According to some accounts, when Marion was committed later, at least part of the brigade got into the British camp where the troops were held up, and then had to pull back from there. But other accounts say that they were committed in the vicinity of the brick house, although that wasn't that far from the tents. So those are problematic, and I haven't been able to find anything definitive yet.
Jim, do you think that Marion's brigade was in a position to take a galling and blood fire from marsh banks into the creek bed?
No, I think they were too far south to come under that kind of fire. So, yeah, Henderson was still taking most of that, as were some of the Marylanders. So, okay, thank you very much.